Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm bringing you guys a brand new catch-up review where I talk about some albums released this year that I didn't have a chance to cover in full when they initially dropped for one reason or another. I will give the specific reason when I talk about each album here, but yeah, today I'm going to be talking about 3 new projects pretty much. And one thing I do want to say before starting this video, aside from the fact that this is just my own personal opinion, is that lately I've been checking out a lot more rock and metal albums released earlier this year, just because I feel like, in terms of my actual full-length reviews I've done this year, a lot of it has been, at least not all of it necessarily, but more of it compared to last year at least, has been hip-hop releases. Now I think this is because hip-hop this year in general has just been pretty prolific in terms of big name releases that I've been wanting to check out. Not necessarily that the quality of the albums have been higher than usual, just the amount of albums I've been wanting to check out has been larger than before. And for that reason, some metal and rock albums have slipped under my radar. And as a result, I spent some of the past couple weeks where I haven't had any new releases I've been really, wanting to check out, just kind of catching up on some big name rock metal releases that have gotten some praise. And as well as checking out some ones from some newer artists, or artists I hadn't heard of before that got some praise this year, just because, I want to find some good new music. And for that reason, all the releases I'm talking about today in this video are metal releases. Yeah, so let's just get right into it then with the first project I want to talk about, the newest album from Horrendous, Idol. Now this is a group I hadn't heard of prior to this album, but this album was getting a lot of praise, so I decided to check it out pretty much. I figured, what do I have to lose? And I'm really happy I did check this thing out because it's easily one of my favorite releases of the year so far, and easily one of my favorite death metal releases in recent years. This is a technical death metal album, but it manages to be one that, appeals more to me, I feel, than it might some other technical death metal fans. What I mean by that is this isn't an overly complicated album, I guess you could say. A lot of technical death metal doesn't really appeal to me just because it starts to get so, mechanical and robotic sounding at times that it really loses a bit of a human touch and some of that nastiness that I like in death metal as a result. And for that reason, it doesn't really click with me all that much. But this album here definitely does not fall into that category. This album definitely has its technical moments. It definitely has some, progressive metal influences as well. It definitely does some things that are way different than your typical, run-of-the-mill death metal record. But it still manages to be very interesting, I guess you could say. That's one thing I would describe this album as, a very interesting project. There's just so much going on here on this project that I find myself in love with every time I listen to it. Well, as I said, there are technical moments spread across this thing, but there's also moments where it gives you a bit more breathing room. It gives you some melody here and there that you can really just kind of latch onto, and it gives you some groove at times as well that also just makes the album stand out more to me. It's not just flashy, technical, insanely fast riff after technical, flashy, insanely fast riff, because for me at least, that gets boring really quickly. They know how to really spice things up, though, here on this project, and that's something I was really happy about when I heard it. I like a lot of the vocals across this thing as well. I like just the diversity in the vocals here as well. At times, they just sound like these very nasty snarls, but other times they maybe sound a bit closer to what you might expect on your more typical death metal album. At times they're higher pitched. At times you even have some clean vocals come in that really add some extra texture to the project as well. It's just, the vocals on this thing are great through and through. I love the fact that the bass guitar on this album is, very present here. It's definitely not buried behind all the other instruments or anything quite like that. It's very easy to, pick apart from everything else, and it just sounds so nice on this project. The drums on here are fantastic as well, and the song structures are incredibly interesting too. As I said before, this album definitely showcases some of its more technical and progressive influences in its song structures, just because these songs at times definitely go through a lot of different changes. At times some of the tracks can get to be a little bit lengthier, but they never really get boring. They always have something interesting going on. Either something interesting is changing up in the track, or it's giving you a very interesting instrumental or vocal part. There's not a dull moment on this thing, really, and there's not a part where it ever feels like it's just trying to pad out its runtime or anything like that. This album is around 40 minutes in length, and it uses all 40 of those minutes to deliver just a really fantastic album. There's not a moment on this thing I was bored. There are also some instrumental tracks across this project that add a little bit extra flavor and atmosphere, particularly the opening track as well as the second to last song on here. Some more less brutal, less in-your-face tracks, I guess you could say, but they add a lot of character and atmosphere to the project as well. That's one thing I really love about this album, is that, as I said before, it's just not flashy, over-the-top technical death metal all the time. There's technical elements to it, but there's also so much more going on here that makes it so satisfying to listen to, and just such an interesting, compelling listen from start to finish. There's not a dull moment on this record. So with that said, I would have to highly recommend this album to you guys if you haven't heard it already, especially if you're a metal fan, especially a death metal fan. Like I said, this is probably one of my favorite death metal releases to come out in recent years. It is definitely worth your time, so definitely check this one out. It's a great album. Next up, we're going to be talking about the newest album from Behemoth, entitled I Loved You at Your Darkest. Now, Behemoth is a group that I had heard things of before in the past. However, I hadn't gotten around to really checking them out yet. I especially heard a lot of good things about their album prior to this one, The Satanist, that was released in 2014. I heard a lot of good things about that album following when it was released. And eventually, when they dropped this new project, I decided, okay, I'll check out that album, and then I'll get around to checking out this new album here. I ended up loving The Satanist. I think that's a great album. If I were to rank out my favorite albums in 2014, not that I have like a definitive list or anything, but I would say definitely make my top 10, to say the least, at least with the albums I've heard as of right now from that year. So then I came into this new album here, hoping that it would at least be a good album. And overall, I think this is also a good album, but not as good an album as The Satanist. This album definitely has a few more aspects to it that I find to be not quite as intriguing, or maybe make the track list overall not as enjoyable through and through, but this is still a solid album from start to finish, and I do like how it does change some things up on it as well. I can't say that I'm super familiar with Behemoth in their back catalog. I've only heard this new album here and The Satanist, but this album definitely was different from their last album. It definitely does change some things up as well. I especially like some of the influences on this thing coming from more, traditional heavy metal, I guess you could say. Especially on a lot of the intros to many of the songs here, they'll oftentimes start off with these more melodic sections that sound like they could be ripped straight out of a more traditional heavy metal song before launching into the more death metal focused aspects of the track. There are also some other moments on here where you maybe have some clean vocals pop up, like on the track Cymbal, for example. But there are, as I said before, some moments on this thing that I'm not quite as hot on. As I kind of alluded to before, many of the tracks on this album start off with these more melodic, traditional metal sections before launching into the death metal part. And while I like that idea for a track, I think it, is interesting, an interesting thing on its own. I like how they mix these kind of two different sounds together to create this atmosphere that's both very brutal, but at times sounds a bit triumphant and a bit melodic as well. The fact that so many of the tracks on this album start off with that structure can be a bit tiresome when you're listening to the project through and through, especially when I picked up on the fact that many of the songs were kind of doing this intro, kind of the same idea pretty much. It became a little less interesting to me. And there are some tracks on here that don't do that necessarily, that they'll maybe start off with more brutal death metal aspects from the get-go. But still, I wish more of the tracks on here maybe change things up a bit in terms of the structure and how they began. Just because a bit too many of the tracks, I feel, started off with that kind of samey structure to it. Another thing about this album I found to be a bit uninteresting was the kind of children's choir that pops in at points here, particularly on the opening track on here, where it's mostly just the children's choir, really. And then also on the track God Equals Dog, which, aside from the children's choir and the kind of dumb name, would probably be one of the stronger cuts on this album. But I just find the children's choir to be really corny. Honestly, this album reminds me a bit of the new Ghost album that dropped earlier this year. Maybe not necessarily in terms of the sound, considering both bands are different subgenres of metal, but still, both albums, both scenarios, the bands were kind of coming off of some really fantastic releases, and in both instances, the bands kind of released decent albums, but albums that had some problems in them, kind of as a result of them maybe overstepping the boundary of the overstepping that line between campy and fun and just outright corny, I guess you could say. Considering both bands kind of do the whole satanic sort of thing to some extent, and I feel like on for Ghost at least on their previous releases, and for Behemoth on their last album at least, like I said, I can't speak for any of their previous albums before that. I felt like the lyrics, I guess, the whole satanic shtick that they have going on for them, while it's not really something I care for all that much, at least it was presented in a way that was pretty solid through and through. But here on this album, as well as, like I said, on that Ghost album that dropped earlier this year, it just feels a bit too campy, I guess you could say, a bit too corny at times for me to really take all that seriously. The Child's Choir is a perfect example of that. In fact, I believe the Ghost album also started off with like an opening track with like children singing as well. It really is surprising how many similarities I could draw between those two projects. But whatever, I'm done talking about that Ghost album. This album here also has some tracks on it that I just feel like aren't as interesting in the grand scheme of things. Like, especially towards the end of this thing, some of the last few tracks on this thing just kind of blurred together, in my opinion, and just weren't all that interesting through and through. Not necessarily that any of them were outright bad or anything, but still, they just didn't interest me quite as much as some of the tracks that appeared earlier in the album. I would say typically the start of the album, outside of like the opening track, is the strongest part of this album, really. But still, it's a decent project overall. I know I had a fair amount of complaints with it, but still, I don't think there's any tracks on this thing that are downright awful or bad necessarily. It's just a project that tries to do some different things. It succeeds in some parts, but it also messes up a few times as well. And I think if Behemoth takes some of the things that they did differently here on this project, but also refined some of the errors that they made here as well, they could come out with another great album next time around if they wanted to. Because like I said, I like a lot of some of the changes they made here. I like some of the more melodic, more traditional heavy metal influences that pop up on some of these tracks here. I just wish that at times maybe the structure of the album was a little bit different, and I wish some of the tracks had a bit more flair to them through and through. But yeah, still a decent project. If you like Behemoth, it's worth checking out. If you like some black and death metal, it's worth checking out. But I'm not sure, at least for me, I wasn't wowed by it. I just enjoyed it. Alright, next up we're going to be talking about the newest EP from Iron Reagan, Dark Days Ahead. Now this one's a bit of an odd one, considering I could have reviewed this in full when it initially dropped. In fact, I was, potentially planning on doing so going into the project. Considering I'm familiar with the group, I had time to review it. It's just that this project gave me so little to talk about that I didn't really feel like making a full review for it. So instead I decided to just kind of tack it on to one of these reviews because, why not, really? I didn't feel like uploading a video that short and going through all the effort of making it if I didn't really have all that much to say about it, basically. So yeah, we're talking about it here. I know it's a bit different from much of the albums I talk about in the segment, but we're going with it pretty much. As I said before, this is the newest EP from this crossover thrash group, and that doesn't really give me a whole lot to talk about, as you could probably tell by that opening I had to give before talking about this project. It's an average project through and through. I wouldn't say it's bad, but at the same time, there's very little on this thing that I really care about all that much. Most of the tracks on this thing run pretty short. In fact, the longest one on here is only a little bit over 2 minutes in length. And the whole EP itself is just a little under 8 minutes in length, so it doesn't take all that long to listen to. But still, there's so little about this thing that really pops out to me. All the tracks on here are performed fine enough, I guess you could say. The vocals sound fine, all the instruments are played fine enough. There are some riffs on this thing that I think are rather crunchy and nice sounding, but that's really all there is to it, I guess you could say. There's also a lot of high energy on this thing as well, but the same thing could be said for lots of crossover thrash releases. I mean, it's kind of a big thing for that genre, and that's kind of the problem I have with this EP, is that it's performed fine enough, it's a solid enough project, but very little about it is really all that memorable in the grand scheme of things. I don't feel like I'm going to return to this thing going forward just because it's so forgettable overall. Yeah, like I said, there's not any performances on here that I think are downright bad. There's no aspects about this thing that pop out to me as being all that awful or anything. It's just that, I don't really feel like I'm going to return to this just because it's so okay and average. I just feel like there's so much better crossover thrash and thrash metal or punk out there that will kind of scratch the same itch for aggressive, fast, high energy music that this EP is just kind of doing okayly, I guess. So yeah, I would say that I'd recommend this to you only if you're like a diehard Iron Reagan fan or a crossover thrash fan, because ultimately there's much better releases in the genre that I think are worth your time. I mean, this thing is a pretty short listen, so I mean, there's not much you have to lose in listening to this thing. I mean, the entire EP itself is shorter than the last track on the Horrendous album I was talking about earlier, but you know, so if you want to give it a listen, I mean, you don't have that much to lose, but there's better ways you could spend about 8 minutes of your life, I feel, than listening to this EP. It's ultimately pretty forgettable in my opinion, and yeah, sorry I don't have much else to say about this one, but it doesn't give me a lot to talk about, guys. Sorry, but yeah, that's just my own opinion on it. And with that said, that concludes this catch-up review. Like I said, I've been checking out some more rock and metal releases from this year, so I have a feeling that as we move into some more catch-up reviews I might be doing later this year, there's going to be some more rock and metal on there as well. Maybe not another one where it's all rock and metal necessarily, but maybe. I don't know, I can't say for sure. But yeah, with that said, thank you guys for watching this video. I greatly appreciate it if you'd leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it, and comment down below your thoughts on either of these albums. If you've heard any of them, leave your thoughts. If you have any recommendations for other great metal or rock releases, or just any releases in general from this year, leave it down in the comment section down below, and maybe I'll check it out on one of these catch-up reviews. Subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more music-related content, things like album reviews, countdown lists, all that good music stuff. Make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching, and stay golden.